We woke up and hauled ass through the streets of Venice, and I found out we'd only missed them by 15 minutes. I'd never seen a carved depiction of a haunting before. It felt like nature was on the verge of retaking the city every high tide. I hope you've been enjoying this trip as much as we did. It's been a lot of fun to share this crazy adventure with you. But lesson 1 is nothing lasts forever, so enjoy each experience while you still can. I woke up on July 12, 2012 and knew we had to get into Venezia or Venice before the meetup time with the rest of the A-Type crew happened. But the place we were staying was farther than I'd expected. Mestre was on the mainland, so we had to find a bus to get us to and across a massive bridge called the Ponte della Libertá that got us into Venice, and then we could go on foot from there. Fun fact, this bridge, which connects the mainland to the archipelago Venice was built on, was originally named Ponte Littorio, but after World War II, they renamed it Ponte della Libertá, or Bridge of Liberty, to celebrate getting out from under Nazi occupation and the dictatorship that went along with that. But when we arrived in Venice and got the first view of the city, Venezia took me by surprise. This was my favorite city of the entire trip. The canals, the architecture, the lifestyle, the food, the mixture of city and sea, even the tiny little alleyways were awe-inspiring to me. It felt like a marvel of human ingenuity that they'd been able to build this city at all. Each half of the crew went to the Santa Lucia train station that morning within a few minutes of when we were supposed to meet. But unfortunately, our exact times and locations didn't overlap. We waited for a while, and then I went to an internet cafe just a few minutes from the station to see if I'd been sent any Facebook messages, and I found out we'd only missed them by 15 minutes. It was frustrating, but we arranged to meet them in Piazza San Marco, or San Marco Square, at 6 p.m. that evening instead. We had a little time to kill, so we explored the city as we went. We got gelato at a stand in front of the train station, figured out our general direction, and then took off through the streets. We started to follow signs to the San Marcos Piazza, but Venice is a maze of canals and alleys, so we got a little lost along the way. It was all part of the fun, but we did have to stop and ask for directions. I'd gotten an Italian for Dummies book to try to give myself a crash course in the language before we started the Carpe Diem trip, so at least someone would speak a little Italian while we were here, but I hadn't had to test it out yet because the staff at the holiday hotel we'd stayed at spoke Spanish. But would I be able to ask for directions in Italian and understand the response? We found a little shop on a street corner, and I went in and approached the woman behind the counter. Scusi, buongiorno, per favore, dove sta la Piazza San Marco? The response that came back was something like, cammina per calle della Rissa e gire l'angolo a sinistra. And I was like, wait, I understood that. That made sense to me in Italian. I speak Italian? Yeah! So I responded, grazie! And we walked along the Calle della Rissa and turned the angle, or corner, to the left. It turns out a lot of languages have a negative word for left, such as sinistra in Italian, same Latin root as sinister, because the Romans saw being left-handed as dishonest, clumsy, or even evil. So if you're unsure of left or right in a Latin-based language, ask yourself which one looks more like rights and which one looks more like sinister. For example, in Spanish, it's derecho for right and izquierda for left. You can even break it down further. Is there an R sound or an S sound? The R is more likely to be right, and the S sound is more likely to be left. My linguistics got out again. But if I had rudely walked in speaking English in a country that doesn't speak that language, would I have gotten the correct directions? I'm not sure if I'd be able to communicate at all. But remember that to walk up to someone and intentionally speak to them in a language they aren't likely to understand will at worst be seen as insulting, or at the very least, frustrating as all hell. Anyway, we made it to La Piazza San Marco, a beautiful area surrounded by classic Venetian buildings. But a little patience here would have gone a long way, because we missed each other by 15 minutes again. We eventually found another internet cafe and sent a message to try again the next day, but it was an interesting similarity to the script. We'd separated and had troubles reconnecting over multiple days. It showed me that my script was realistic, at least. These were issues that could and did happen. And even with limited communication via internet cafes, it was still hard to meet back up with them. So on July 13th, we woke up and hauled ass through the streets of Venice to make sure we made it to the Piazza San Marco on time. And at 11 a.m., we finally reunited. We all hugged each other as they shared stories of sleeping on the beach in Monte Carlo, and I told them about our sketchy taxi ride to Venice. It was great to reconnect, and all four of us got gelato together to celebrate. When in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? Even if it's Venice. Then we went off to shoot what felt like the most important scene in the film, where our characters finally met up with Aaron's character Daniel again. And we started the scene off by filming on a gondola. We were able to shoot Aaron both riding in the gondola and getting out of it. It was a shot I felt was necessary due to how famous Venetian gondolas were, so we split the bill and all four of us rode on the gondola because it cost 100 euros for about 30 minutes. But it was worth it for the story, the experience, and the shots. I also thought it was fitting that we shot this scene right after we actually met back up in real life. We were again able to pull from the actual emotions we'd just experienced around being separated and unable to meet back up for longer than expected, and I think that realism came out in our performances. We shot the largest segment of that scene in an alley that felt totally deserted.
Daniel!
What was that?
No one interrupted us while we shot it, and it felt good to get that done.
Look at this amazing wall.
Alright, okay.
I actually appreciate it.
Put me on the
left
third so that I can look out and still have space here.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
We officially had enough important scenes completed to finish the film, even if we had to shoot the rest back in the US. A large amount of stress melted away at that point, so we had some good laughs too. Whether it was puns.
Does he say ni poo?
No, what the
Instead of ni hao?
No. Nothing like that.
Were you rolling on that?
Yes.
Harry Potter jokes.
Hey, you can join in. We'll make it a Tri-Wizard tournament.
Okay, let's do this.
It'll be Cedric Dickering.
I really want to get this done, please.
Harry asshole.
Oh my god.
Yeah, or even just oddities while shooting.
Action.
Oh, yeah.
Are you alright?
Cut.
Cut.
Ready to do that again?
Oh, I miss you guys so much.
Are you alright?
I am perfectly fine. How are you guys doing?
Like catching your breath was just rang, damn you.
How are you guys doing?
We
my
ran
line?
miles around Venice.
What have you
searching
guys
you.
been doing?
What's up, guys? Are you alright? I'm great. You're so awesome. What have you guys been doing? Right?
Yeah, he said, how are you guys?
That's still wrong.
Honestly, shooting that scene felt like a reward for having made it that far on the trip. Because I'd known from the get-go that the only way to shoot the ending was to actually make it through the 5 weeks while still being close enough to on schedule to get on our flight home. With smiles all around, I recorded us goofing off in the piazza. The pink sunset made the moment feel almost surreal. But I knew this joviality was as much to celebrate the fact we'd managed to meet back up as it was that we'd shot an ending. But while shooting in Venice, we quickly came to realize that Mother Nature is a much larger factor here, similar to Loch Ness in some ways. Because when we'd shot in London or Paris, the wilderness felt very far away. But in Venice, it felt like nature was on the verge of retaking the city every high tide. Fun fact too, in English it's common to say Mother Nature or Mother Earth, but the Lakota Oyate use the phrase Unchi Maka, or Grandmother Earth. And to be honest, I like that description better because it feels like it more accurately describes the relationship between humans and nature. I'd never seen city streets flood with seawater in real life until that day, but it showed me that this city would not exist forever, at least not in the way it did when we were there. I realized that we were kind of capturing a snapshot of history, a look at what all these famous places we'd visited were like back in the summer of 2012, and what Western Europe as a whole kind of felt like during that time period. I wondered what would be the first things to change or be destroyed entirely, and unfortunately, Venice seemed high on that list. Take a look at the difference over time and you'll see what I mean. Pretty shocking, huh? This was a time when paying attention to high and low tide was very important. But unfortunately, I didn't learn that particular lesson until much later on. I'll get to this, but always pay attention to the tide. It can and will kill you. That evening, it came up that we only had one more city to explore on this trip. And all of a sudden, it seemed like time must have sped up. We couldn't possibly be reaching the end of the trip already. But at the same time, we felt exhausted in a way that a night's sleep could not fix. And we knew that we couldn't keep up the pace we've been going at for much longer. But because we'd arrived in Venice on different days, due to availability and price changes, half of the crew was staying at a different hostel than the other half. So we'd have to separate again and meet back up the next day, which was a little nerve-wracking considering how hard it was to meet back up the first time. You know, I've told a lot of stories about what happened on this trip. And there's a great story that night involving a 4-course meal eaten outdoors under the stars that lasted for over 3 hours. But you'd probably rather hear one last hostel story that's more of a 1-course meal, if you get my meaning. So, let's get to story time. Half of our crew returned to their hostel, and it set in that the clock was ticking on our time here. In fact, this was the last hostel we'd be staying at on the trip, and that meant it was the last opportunity for our single guys to meet fellow travelers in a place with a bed. But that night didn't go quite the way they expected it would. Our international pipe layer, if you will, managed to sneak away and talk to other people in the hostel, as he often did, and he hit it off with an attractive woman who was staying on the same floor. He ended up going back to her room, which I'm assuming was either empty or only had sleeping people in it, because remember, these were not private rooms, and things got a little hot and heavy. You know, they made out, clothes came off, and he actually started giving oral sex. But her legs stayed wrapped around his neck, and he proceeded to spend the next hour going down on this woman while she let him know that was exactly what she was looking for. Finally, her hands slipped off his head, and he thought it was finally time for him to get some action. But no, it was late. She'd fallen asleep. He stood there for a second, absolutely flabbergasted that that was even possible, and then, realizing that this was a public bedroom, pulled the covers up over her and creeped back out of the room to take a shower, and they never saw each other again. That's one of the biggest issues with having sex with strangers. You don't always know what their preferences are. And he's lucky he didn't catch anything. On July 14th, we returned to the island and had our last meal in Venice, which for me was a spaghetti steak, an absolutely fantastic dish that I've never seen anywhere else. They cooked a large steak with onions and garlic, and put a bowl of marinara pasta on top of the steak. So as you ate through the pasta, the sauce dripped down onto the steak below. It might sound unusual, but it was one of the best things I've ever tasted in my life. And personally, I thought Italy won the crown for best food of the trip because of it. My mouth is watering so much even talking about this that it's hard to get the words out. That's how good it was. After that, we successfully managed to meet the other half of the crew at the Santa Lucia train station, and we took a train to Firenze, which English speakers apparently decided to rename Florence. Fun fact 3, the French call Firenze Florence, and that's why we have a city in the US named Florence, Alabama, instead of Firenze, Alabama, even though the city was founded by an Italian engineer born in Firenze. Anyway, once we got to Firenze, we followed our pattern of cheap eating as best we could and went to a McDonald's opposite the station to get free Wi-Fi in order to figure out directions to the campsite we'd read about back when we were putting the itinerary together. We got 5 hamburgers and a water bottle for €6 total to curb the hunger while we looked for real restaurants and a place to stay. I noticed that I'd eaten more McDonald's in 5 weeks in Europe than I had in the past decade in the US. But without access to a kitchen or money to eat at good restaurants all the time, cheap fast food was important for us to be able to keep going. We made our way to the campsite we'd found online, and we reached a massive set of steps going up a hill that led to our campsite. After a real workout for our quads, we reached the top and saw a massive recreation of Michelangelo's famous David statue. Then we turned around and saw that this area overlooked the whole city, and it was beautiful. The campsite, just a few minutes away, was only 14 euros per persona per notte, or per person per night, so it felt like the right choice. And we camped right there on the outskirts of a city that felt much more at ease with Unchi Maka and much calmer than Venice. As a quick side note, if you're ever unsure how to say night in either a Romance or Germanic language, remember that the word for night is usually associated with the time the sun sets, so try using the number 8 in that language and kind of mashing an N onto the beginning. For example, in English, N plus 8 equals night. In Spanish, N plus ocho equals noche. In French, N plus huit equals nuit. In Italian, N plus otto equals notte. In German, N plus acht equals Nacht. Albanian, N plus tete equals natte. Norwegian, N plus ate equals nat. I might not be pronouncing all that correctly, but bear with me. Even in Scottish Gaelic, 8 is ocht, and tonight is a nocht. But there are plenty of languages where that doesn't work, so it's not a rule, it's just kind of likely in Europe. Ooh, my linguistics got off the leash this time. But anyway, we checked in, set up our tents, and showered at the bathroom building that the campsite had set up there. Then Aaron, Colin, and I took a walk around the camp's hillside right around the time the sun set, and we talked about the trip and our next steps while Selena was resting in the tent. What I learned from that conversation is we were really happy with this trip. We'd seen different sorts of cities and countries all over Europe, tried foods from different cultures, seen different ways of life, partied in different capital cities. And although we hadn't shot every scene in the script, we'd shot way more than had been written, and considered this trip an overwhelming success. We'd done a good amount of travel that day, so we weren't keen to do anything else that night, but it felt a little weird to know that this was the last city we'd be shooting in and exploring on this trip. We'd gotten used to this lifestyle over the past 5 weeks, and soon we'd have to change back to a lifestyle of living with our parents for the final month or so before college, and that just kind of felt bizarre after traveling the world, and then we'd have to change again to adapt to going to college. And even then, we knew those dorms would only be temporary too. Change seemed to be the only constant. And in hindsight, our group of 4 travelers would only ever reunite once, and only for a few hours. But we'll get to that later down the road. After a night in the tents, we woke up on July 15th, and it was stiflingly hot. We went to the communal showers to try to cool off, and then we explored as much as we could. Firenze really felt like the farewell stop of our adventure, with little left that we could shoot here, but a whole new city to see. We quickly went grocery shopping to restock on some food, and then we walked downtown and took photos and videos of La Santa Maria del Fiore, the 3rd largest cathedral in the world that we didn't even know was there until we stumbled upon it. But we found that we couldn't go inside because, like a number of religious institutions, they require pants, closed-toed shoes, and a shirt with sleeves to enter the building. And we were all in shorts, and half of us were in tank tops because of how hot it was, so we weren't allowed inside. We also found a square called La Piazza della Signoria, and were surprised to find a number of really interesting statues guarding the entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, including depictions of David, Hercules fighting a centaur, and even Perseus having just cut off Medusa's head. These statues were so large and yet so detailed, I wasn't sure whether to try to get the whole thing in one shot or to zoom in just to better see just how finely crafted they were. We explored Il Cimitero delle Porte Sante, or the Cemetery of the Holy Gates, famous for its sculptures as well, and I saw some of the creepiest statues I'd ever seen. I'd never seen a carved depiction of a haunting before, and it made my skin crawl. I was back to thinking about the supernatural and the horror film I wanted to make, but after that, we made a discovery that made my day. When we were walking back towards the huge stairs up that mountain, I found a gelato stall and my eyes widened. I'd finally found a place that sold blood orange gelato. I was so happy. It was my favorite flavor by far, and I'd been searching for it throughout this entire trip. I would never ask for orange-flavored ice cream, but to this day, if you asked me what my favorite frozen dessert is, it's blood orange gelato. It's not even close. I've never tasted anything quite like it. We ate dinner at a cafeteria-style restaurant called a Canteen Buffet that night because I was pretty much out of money by then, both checking and savings, so I had to keep things pretty cheap after that. I'd expected this to happen at some point, since I was putting everything I had into making this picture, but it still hurt to realize that moment had finally come. I didn't really see any of my purchases as unnecessary expenditures, though, because if anyone had been too unhealthy or unhappy, the film wouldn't have gotten finished. Maybe not the trip either. So those hotels with air conditioning, for example, that had been necessary to get us strong enough to keep going. Our final tourist attraction of the day was the Ponte Vecchio, a famous bridge in Firenze with all sorts of shops along it, like a city street, but all the way across the Fiume Arno, or the Arno River, and I got some magical shots of the sunset there. Some of us went to see a live performance of Romeo and Juliet that night, in Italian. Some of us walked back up the hill and watched some fireworks going off in the distance, but at least one of us wanted to have a high-end meal here as well. So we found a restaurant and he ordered a steak. But this was Firenze, and so this wasn't just a normal steak. This was a famous Tuscan dish called the Bistecca alla Fiorentina, a delicious T-bone steak that the city is famous for cutting thick and large and browning to a crust on the outside with a soft pink interior, often for sharing between 2 or more people with a bottle of red wine. But we were so hungry, one of us ate one entirely on their own. We realized that tonight was our last night sleeping in the tents, which was both a relief and a bit sad, because we'd gotten to see some incredible places by using the 2 tents, even if it meant privacy was minimal and amenities were basically non-existent. You'll also notice that even though alcohol was still accessible all around us, there weren't any more stories about anyone getting too drunk. We really grew up during that trip, and that included learning to get a handle on alcohol. But there's no peer pressure to drink heavily in Europe the way we'd experienced back in the United States, so don't worry, there'll be more wild bacchanals to come. Side note, a bacchanal is basically a drunken party or celebration named after the Roman god of wine and fertility, Bacchus, who you might recognize better by what the Greeks called him, Dionysus. After a very warm night, we woke up in our well-used tents on July 16th, and it was still so hot. So we got bread, water, cereal, and fruit bars from a market nearby, and then we packed up our tents and checked out. We stayed by the cafe near the campsite to avoid the heat and talked about the trip. We were saying how we'd learned a lot and wouldn't make the same mistakes next time if there was a next time. Lesson 2 is an image can hold a memory. Another American traveler named Peter came up to us and introduced himself. He was on a very similar trip to ours, but he'd started in Poland, went through Germany and Greece, and was now going from Italy towards France after a flight from Greece to Rome. He'd been traveling alone with a Eurail pass, and his parents were funding it, but he seemed a little lonely. Luckily, he met people like us along the way in different countries, and we actually had a lot to talk about. He also had a camera he'd taken with him, but a film camera instead of a digital camera, and he took a photo of each of us and said he'd get them developed later. He got gelato with us. I was happy to get more blood orange gelato, and then we all took the bus to the city center. We talked for about 3 hours or so before we had to split up, so we made sure that we found him on Facebook and had him like the A-Type Studios page so we could show him the film one day. He actually ended up attending Aaron's alma mater 1 year under him, and he posted the photos of us and tagged us in them after he got back to the States, which was very cool. When I saw the photos, I was instantly transported back to that moment. I remembered the heat of the sun, the shade we hid under, the breeze, the wood of the benches we sat on. I'd forgotten the details of the moment until then, but it was like that memory was contained right within the photograph, and it activated it as soon as I saw it. I've noticed there are at least 4 to 5 times in my life when I met an individual once and never again, but remembered them for the rest of my life. And this was one of the more memorable meeting a person events I have. We only hung out for a few hours, but I still remember his full name, what he looked like, etc. And I'm always surprised by what memories stick in my mind, especially after my accident, but for some reason, that was one of them. Because a lot of people remember things that are important to them, whenever I remember meeting someone specific, I always wonder if there was something important about that memory. But usually, I'm not able to find any reason why it's important at all. I'll get more into that when we get to the accident, but for now, just know that these photos are most likely why I remember that event so clearly. But Peter had to board his train to his next destination, so we went to McDonald's for one last cheap meal before we had to head to the train station ourselves. Aaron had 4 €1 hamburgers and 2 drinks. I had 4 of the same hamburgers. Selena had 2 hamburgers, an ice cream and small fries. And Colin had just 2 hamburgers. I think it's worth noting that because of our different statures, muscle masses, backpack weights, and metabolisms, each of us needed a very different amount of food to survive, even when we were doing very close to the same amount of exercise. I'd learn more about what affects metabolism later on, but I thought it was worth noting that Aaron and I needed over double the calorie count of the other members just in order to maintain our weight. I think it might be time for one last story time. After McDonald's, we got on the train from Firenze to Milan, our last train ride of the trip, which ended up being full of Italian nuns. I'd never seen that many nuns in one place before and wondered if there was like a convention of nuns or something they were headed to. However, this was also the last possible time our single guys on the trip could meet anyone. And one person, I think you know who, took full advantage of that. You see, this train wasn't filled exclusively with nuns, just mostly nuns. So one of us started talking up some of the other people on the train. This trip lasted for hours, so he had plenty of time to see who might be interested and to get a little friendly, and things started to get intense. And he ended up in an empty compartment having sex while we were on the train full of nuns. No one ever let him forget that one. But once we arrived at the Milan train station, Aaron went off to find an ATM, Colin went to find a bathroom, but then I found out that our bus was leaving in 10 minutes. So I ran off to look for Aaron, carrying both my own and Selena's backpack so she could run to look for Colin. For this final epic sprint of the trip, I was carrying a total of 80 pounds as I ran through the station, the most weight I'd ever carried at speed before. We'd made a whole movie about getting separated in a train station. We couldn't actually have the problem after we'd shot the ending. This felt like the hardest run of my life, carrying about 60% of my body weight on my back as I dodged other travelers in the station. But I managed to find him. We booked it back to the stop, but it just wasn't enough. We missed the bus. We sat down dejected. All four of us were back together though, so we were ready when, luckily, a second bus pulled up a few minutes later. We arrived at the airport and were able to check in on time, but if we had missed that second bus, we would have missed the flight. I think we used every single drop of luck we had on this trip. We had to say goodbye to some mementos of our unusual odyssey in order to get home though. When we went through security, they took the walking stick we'd found in San Sebastian from Season 2, Episode 6, and the huge jar of Nutella from Season 2, Episode 3. He was sad to part with it after carrying it for all that time, and I was sad to part with our only boom pole in the production, but they wouldn't let him check it or carry it on the flight. So we gave up the stick and got on our first Ryanair flight. That'll be important in a minute. Lesson 3. To disappear, show you have no value to the onlooker. This sounds like a strange lesson, but it's simple, and it can be useful sometimes. Once we were on the flight from Milan to London Stansted Airport, people came by asking if I wanted anything to drink, and I told them I didn't have any money, knowing that at that point I could only afford free in-flight amenities. They frowned, gave me an unapologetic look, and ignored me for the rest of the flight. Showing that I had no sales opportunities for them made me essentially invisible. No one bothered me or asked if I wanted to buy any of the other things they brought around after that. However, in doing so, I lost all respect they may have had for me, so it's a tactic that has to be used wisely. For example, we had used it successfully when prostitutes had solicited us in Barcelona. We started getting lots of attention while walking down the street at night, but the moment we said we were broke, they left us alone. Didn't care anymore. While we were on the flight, someone came around offering train tickets from the airport, so one of us bought tickets from London Stansted to Liverpool Street in downtown London, so we at least had a way back from the airport, and it cost about 80 euros. Unfortunately, by the time our flight landed, we'd already missed the last train back to Liverpool Street by about 20 minutes. So anyone who purchased connecting tickets on that flight basically burned their money, and no refunds were offered. To make it even worse, someone stole my cell phone right out of my checked bag. I wondered who would even have access to checked bags other than airport staff, and wondered if someone who worked there had stolen it. Whoever it was called my grandparents from my phone asking for money, so I had the phone deactivated. And unfortunately, that meant I returned to the US without the ability to contact anyone I'd known earlier in life except through social media. And I know I lost a couple friends that way, as well as losing every photo I'd taken on my phone from January 2012 through July 2012. My written memory is still sparse in that time period because of it, But the weird thing is, it's the only time I've ever had anything stolen from inside a checked bag, and that's the only thing they took. Luckily, my camera and the SD cards had been in my carry-on. But could you imagine if someone had stolen the SD cards after 5 weeks of filming? It was a very precarious situation, but we didn't have any way to make backups until after we got back to California. So we were stuck carrying all the footage with us at all times and just hoping it was safe. To add insult to injury, we connected to the London Stansted Wi-Fi and found out that one of us had lost their summer job that year and would be coming back unemployed after we'd spent all or most of our savings on the trip. That made it a tough return to reality in 3 ways, and we weren't even home yet. We ended up having to take a coach or bus to Liverpool Street instead, and that cost us another £40 on top of the €80 we'd already spent on the useless train tickets. From Liverpool Street in central London, we got a taxi to take us back to Greenwich, and that cost us another £23. No one was in a great mood after all that. We felt frustrated, tired, and worried about the future, but we crashed as soon as we got back to Selena's flat. Lesson 4. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. We woke up on July 17th, still feeling a little irked, but on our last full day in Europe, we met up with Ian Arbor again, this time with his publicist Bob, at the same Cafe Nero by Trafalgar Square. And Bob was very professional and definitely knew what he was doing. And luckily, he liked our idea, thought that we had a great movie concept, and he wanted Ian on board. I did the majority of the talking at that point because I felt a lot more confident about the film now that we'd shot most of it, and I knew we had something unique here. We'd avoided a lot of the cliches and stereotypes that movies like Eurotrip are famous for. We'd grounded it in reality by pulling our actual experiences into the plot, and I felt our moods start to improve as we reflected on what we'd actually been able to accomplish. After that, we went to Pineapple Dance Studios, where Selena at the time worked as an assistant dance instructor, but she'd soon start teaching her own classes there as well. She managed to get us in for free, and we found an empty studio to film Selena's character's dance scene. According to Selena, it took around 4 hours to shoot that scene, and she wasn't happy with her performance, feeling that she could have put more into it if she'd been able to practice more and wasn't just coming back from a 5-week backpacking trip. Hoping for the best, we talked about reshooting the scene in the future if possible, but we planned for the worst and got what we needed in case we never had an opportunity to shoot it again. At that point, one of us took a street hip-hop class while we were there, and our theater lover went to see another show on the West End for £40, the Phantom of the Opera this time. To highlight the difference between our experiences, one of us saw 5 live shows on this trip, one of us only saw 2, and another didn't see any live shows at all. That was a pretty great last day, but we knew we didn't have the whole film shot. There were scenes that had just been too difficult to shoot live, such as club scenes when we didn't have control over lighting, music, or the crowds, so we realized that we were going to have to shoot those back in the States, but at least they were indoor scenes, so they'd be easier to pass off as taking place in Europe. On top of that, we also knew we had to shoot the scenes of telling the story to our friend once we got back, so we knew that we were returning without a completed feature film, but with a lot more footage than we'd originally intended. I'd been hoping for at least 40 minutes because that's the shortest feature film length accepted at most film festivals, but we came back with what would be over an hour of the film, and we had plans to shoot that first act that we still hadn't written yet. After one final night sleeping anywhere we could find space in Selena's flat, on the morning of July 18th, 2012, we packed our bags and headed to Heathrow Airport, taking the tube or underground as we talked about what a hell of an adventure we'd had, the amazing times we'd experienced, and the memories we'd cherish. As we walked into Heathrow International Airport, Selena gave me a biography of Robin Williams, written by Andy Dugan, because she knew how much of a role model he was to me. Because of that, I've always seen learning more about Robin Williams as a reward for completing principal photography of my first feature film. And it was hard to leave, but we had to. I know I've tried to avoid talking about relationship stuff as much as possible, but the reason I gave Carpe Diem the ending it has is because at that point, Selena and I had been dating long distance since October of 2011, but she had a plan to move back to the US on a student visa in May of 2013. So we had an end in sight, which made getting on the plane a little easier. I made a promise that I'd come back to London one more time before she moved back to the US, and I refilled my Oyster card to prove that I was serious. And then we got on the flight, and our European odyssey was coming to an end. While we were on the flight home, I wrote in my journal that it will be weird to have only a month and a half left to live at my parents' house before I go off to college in Whittier in LA. One adventure will lead into another. I've learned so much on this trip, and I feel very much changed in coming back. I'm noticing myself thinking much more about my life and future and what I want to do in life. My priorities seem more in order, and I've started to think about starting a family and making a career for myself. Reading the biography on Robin Williams really helped me to see things in a new light. I read all 280 pages on the flight home because Selena gave it to me as a graduation present. It was perfect, exactly what I needed. A beautiful gift. One that unfortunately would only get more poignant after his death, but I'll get to that later. I'm trying to keep this whole project in chronological order as best I can, otherwise it would get really confusing, so I'll talk about Carpe Diem's odd, spread-out American unit of photography in later episodes, but for now, just know that we didn't go right back into shooting when we got home, because we had to cut all that footage together in order to know what gaps we needed to fill in both the film and the plot, and then I had to write those scenes to hopefully make a cohesive movie. But that wraps up our 37-day principal unit of photography on Carpe Diem, and the incredible adventure we had along the way. I hope that this window into our lives helps future filmmakers make better movies, future travelers take better trips, and helps audiences enjoy Carpe Diem a lot more now that they know the stories surrounding it and just how close to real life it actually was. But you'll have to wait until season 3 to hear about how I was on the set of a different film less than 48 hours after I got back from the Carpe Diem trip.
If you fuck up, I want this to get on Ray William Johnson.
Okay.
I'll buy you a wool coat and some sheepskin condoms when we get...
How could you do that? Pan from the church onto us walking.
Walking down there.
Or maybe just walking alongside it.
Action.
Perdón, me preguntaba si podía escucharme. Soy de los Estados Unidos y tengo...
Behind the scenes, I don't know if there's focus. I highly doubt it. But cool.